in a complicated situation. Complicated situation. And as a result of Sarai's treatment towards Hagar, Hagar is on the run, which then leads us to scene 2, which is divine promise. Hagar, who is poor, abused, pregnant, she's on the run. And she's just running. And in verse 7, here's what we're told. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And here's all she says, I am running away. I'm running away from my mistress. Part of me thinks it's like she doesn't know where she's going. She's just, I'm out of here. I have to get away from this situation. And so she runs away and she comes near to a spring near the border of Egypt, and this angel appears to her. And now, everyone's question is this a pre-incarnation of Christ? I don't know. But here's what I will say is that God is intervening in her life. That in her trouble, in her pain, in her suffering, in her mistreatment, God meets her where she is at. And the angel says to her in verse 9, go back to your mistress and submit to her authority. Now just think about that statement for a moment. You're running away because of the mistreatment you've experienced. You've been basically used by Abram and Sarai to provide for them what they want, children. And now you're being told to go back to that abuse, back to that mistreatment, and to submit to that authority. That is a wild statement. I mean, if you're Hagar, you're thinking, why? How does this work? Well, verse 10, this is what God says to her. I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. This is an amazing statement made to a girl, to a woman, who in one sense is a nobody in the world. This slave girl, been used and mistreated, on the run, is then given this amazing promise by God, the creator of heaven and earth, that her descendants would be too many to count. Similar to what is being told of Abram's descendants in these promises, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, that her descendants would be too many to count. And she goes from a position of dishonor to honor. And the angel says to her in verse 11, you have conceived, and you'll have a son, and you will name him Ishmael. For the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. Ishmael means that God has heard. God has heard her cry of affliction. God has seen what has gone on in her life. And God makes a promise to her that I will bless you. I will make your descendants numerous as the stars in the sky, so to speak. And then God tells her what her son would be like. This man would be like a wild donkey, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will settle near all of his relatives. The phrase wild donkey, the idea, it's used as a figure, used in the Old Testament to figure a person or to communicate about a particular type of person who is an individualistic lifestyle. They're kind of untamed. They won't just kind of fold into social convention. This son of hers would be this wild man whose hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. That he would live in constant conflict to those around him. And there's the historical reality that Ishmael's offspring, the Arab nation, Muslims, this is whom Ishmael's offspring became, and they became a real thorn in the side of God's people, both in the Old and the New Covenant. They became a real thorn. And this points back to the consequences of Abram and Sarai's decision, their failure to trust God. That the consequences in some cases are lifelong consequences. One commentator put it, little did Abram and Sarai imagine that their shortcut would originate a conflict that would run for millennia and that oceans of blood would be spilled. That oceans of blood would be spilled. The conflict in the Middle East that still ensues today comes from this. That some consequences, when faith is absent, are lifelong consequences. Yet God makes this promise to Hagar, and Hagar responds to God's promise. And he says to her, you are El Roi, for she said, in this place have I actually seen the one who sees me? That is why the well is called Bir Lahai Roi, which is between Kadesh and Bered. Notice Hagar. Hagar doesn't get fixated on what God says about Ishmael and what he would become, but on God himself. And in amazement, she names God. She gives a name to God and a name to the place that she is at. And both are celebrating this reality that God sees her in her pain, that he has looked after her in her trouble, in her difficulty. And what happens? Well, Hagar goes back in verse 15 and gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. Exactly as the angel of the Lord had promised, it happened. Hagar gave birth to a son, and Abram, who's 86 years old, gives the name that God told Hagar to name her son, Ishmael, which indicated that Abram accepted her story, that he believed her, that he accepted the promise that God made to her and took her back and took responsibility for her and his son.